chased by the ghostly sound coming from the forest. So this happened last year during a family camp that my wife and I organized. It was to be a quiet weekend, something simple, just the two of us, no distractions, away from the city. We chose a campsite that was in a secluded area, with few tents and lots of space around. It was a very rustic place, one where you only hear the sound of the wind, the singing of birds, and the movement of trees. And honestly, that's what attracted us. We wanted a total rest, without the excitement that is usually always surrounding us. That night, after an impromptu dinner at the campfire, we were talking outside the tent, enjoying the starry sky and the silence that the forest offered. It was that absolute silence, but relaxing, you know. Suddenly, in the middle of that tranquility, we started to hear a distant sound. At first, I thought it was something in my head, a very low and faint sound, almost like a whisper lost among the trees. I looked at my wife and realized that she was listening too. When we focused our attention a little more, we could tell it was a song. But it wasn't just any song. That melody was too familiar for us, but it did not make the least sense to be playing there in the middle of the forest. It was an old version of an instrumental song we chose for our wedding, something very specific, that we never heard after that day. I felt an instant shiver, but still tried to convince myself that it was some strange coincidence, maybe someone camping nearby with a speaker, or whatever. My wife looked at me with a look that mixed curiosity and discomfort, and I knew she was thinking the same thing as I. How that song, exactly that one, was playing there. We decided to get up and follow the sound, curious and at the same time with a feeling that it was very strange. The closer we got, the clearer the music became, as if it was taking us to some point in the forest. We walked a few meters into the forest, deviating from branches and stepping on dry leaves that popped under our feet. The music seemed so out of place there, but at the same time so close. Suddenly, as if someone had turned down the volume, the sound began to get weaker, until it almost disappeared. We stopped for a moment, looking around, trying to understand where it came from. And it was in this heavy silence that I noticed something even more strange. The night seemed to have become colder, and the air, which was cool before, now had an almost suffocating weight. My wife began to look around, and I could see the discomfort in her eyes. I was already questioning our decision to go after that song. We were alone there, in the middle of the forest, at night, following a melody that had only meant for us two, and that should not be playing. I thought of suggesting we go back to camp, but before I could speak, I noticed a faint glow on the ground near a fallen tree. When we approached, we saw that the brightness came from an old cassette tape, those plastic, with a worn adhesive on the side. And there, beside the tape deck, was a cassette tape with a label written on it. When I leaned down to look better, my heart felt throbbing. On the label were our names and the date of our wedding, written exactly as we had done in the souvenirs for the guests. It was impossible to ignore how bizarre that was. That tape was exactly the same as we made to play at our wedding. My wife became pale, and I, not knowing what to think, took the tape and looked closer, as if I would find some explanation in the middle of those details. My mind was a total mess. Who would have left that there? And mainly, how did you know the song of our wedding, the date, our names? The tape player looked old, as if it had been left there for years, but the tape was intact. I hesitated for a second, but my curiosity was stronger. I put the tape on the tape player and pressed the play. At the same instant, the melody began to play, just as we heard in our wedding, from beginning to end, without fail. It was surreal to hear that there, in the middle of nowhere, as if someone was making fun of us, or maybe trying to remind us of something I couldn't understand. My wife held me by the arm, clearly scared, and with each passing second, the sound seemed to echo more and more through the forest, filling the silence around us. Then something made me freeze. Around among the trees, I began to see shadows moving, very discreet, but there, surrounding us. I wondered if it was my mind playing tricks on fear, but the whole environment seemed strange, as if the forest was somehow alive, watching everything. The music continued, and each note seemed to carry a different weight, almost dark, as if it had some message that I could not decipher. As the music played, and those shadows seemed to approach, a real panic took hold of me. I knew I had to do something, but it seemed like my feet were stuck on the ground, as if something was forcing me to listen to the end of that tape. My wife, with her eyes wide open, whispered to us to come back, but even in the whisper I could see the fear in her voice. Finally, in a desperate urge, I reached for the tape player and pressed the stop button. At the very second that the music stopped, silence returned in an almost oppressive way. What happened next was even stranger. As soon as the sound ceased, the shadows I thought I had seen dissipated, as if they had never been there. Only the environment did not return to normal. The air was still heavy, and the feeling that we were being watched did not go away. I took the tape player with the tape inside, perhaps in the hope that if we had that object, we could understand who had left it there and why. We turned quickly and start walking back to the camp, without looking back. With each step, I felt a shiver running through my spine, and my wife squeezed my hand so hard that she could barely feel my fingers. When finally we got back to our tent, I threw the tape player on the floor and tried to calm down, but we couldn't stop shaking. I looked at the turntable there, motionless, as if it were some object, but I knew that it carried something disturbing, something I still could not understand. After a while, we decided it was better to leave. The initial plan was to spend the weekend, but after what happened, none of us wanted to stay there for another minute. We packed our things as quickly as possible, always looking at the darkness around, as if something was waiting to stop us from leaving. We got into the car, and as we moved away from the camp, the strange weight in the air seemed to finally disappear. Even so, that feeling that something or someone had left that turntable there especially for us haunted me for days. Since that night, I can't stop thinking about who could have done this and especially why. The music of our wedding was something very personal, something that only we and a few people close knew. It makes no sense that someone left a tape with that music in the forest, just when we were camping. I've thought of several explanations. It could be a joke of bad taste, an absurd coincidence, or even some kind of sign. But the more I try to understand, the more everything seems bizarre and impossible to explain. To this day, the tape player is kept in my garage, inside a box that I avoid opening. Sometimes I think about getting rid of it, but something stops me, as if I was still waiting for an answer that may never come. My wife also prefers not to talk about what happened, but I see that she still carries the same discomfort, especially when playing that song, which we avoid as much as possible. As much as I try to move forward, the feeling that this moment was more than a coincidence still haunts me. It all started when I returned to my parents' house in a small rural town where I spent most of my childhood. They were moving to a smaller house in town and needed help packing things. The region is well isolated, surrounded by forests and trails that we always explored when I was younger. It was a bit nostalgic feeling to be back, but the place also had a kind of heavy air that I did not remember feeling before. Maybe it was the strange weather of the day or the different silence of the forest, but there was something there that made me uncomfortable. While I was organizing boxes and taking old things from the attic, I decided to take a walk in the forest near the house. I knew it well that way, but it had not been explored for years. After a few minutes walking, I saw an old shed with walls full of moss and pieces of wood falling apart. I never remember seeing that before, which I found a bit strange. The curiosity was greater, so I decided to go in and see what was inside. As soon as I entered, the strong smell of mold and something too old made me almost back. It was a tiny place, with little light coming in through the cracks, and the ground was covered with dust and dry leaves. As I got used to the darkness, I started seeing some details that immediately gave me a shiver. In the corner, there were a lot of children's shoes, as if someone had thrown them all there at once. They were small, spent, and covered with dirt, looking abandoned for decades. That vision stirred me, but at the same time, I thought it might be some forgotten deposit. I kept looking around, and noticed that on the walls there were drawings and marks crossed with something sharp. They were strange symbols, some looking like geometric figures, others more like distorted words. Among them, I noticed a drawing that reminded me of a child, only with the face scratched several times, as if someone had tried to erase the traces. My heart was beating fast, and I could not take my eyes off those images. I decided it was better to leave there as soon as possible, but at the same time, I felt that I was leaving something important behind. I left the shed with a strange feeling, as if I had done something wrong just by going in there. As I walked away, I looked back a few times, hoping to see something or someone, but the place was still empty and quiet, as if nothing had happened. I went back to my parents' house, but the image of the shoes and symbols on the walls stayed in my head. I briefly told them about the shed, but they seemed not to remember anything like it there, which only increased my curiosity, or perhaps my restlessness. Later that same day, when I finally stopped to rest and get my phone, I saw that I had a message from an unknown number. The first thing I thought was some spam, but when opened, the content of the message left me cold. Someone had written, "Did you enjoy the visit to the shed?" At the time, I thought it was a joke of bad taste, but nobody, except my parents, knew that I was there that day. The idea that someone could have followed me and watched without me realizing made my stomach turn. I was staring at the screen of the phone for a few seconds, not knowing what to think. My mind was trying to find a logical explanation, something that did not involve someone spying on me in the forest. I decided to answer, asking who I was and how I knew I had gone to the shed. I waited a few minutes and nothing. No response, no notification. I started to think that maybe it was better to ignore. That could be just a bizarre coincidence. But, honestly, my instinct was already telling me that it would not end well. Later, while I was still trying to focus on the change, another message arrived. This time, it was a precise description of each place I had passed throughout the day, as if someone were narrating each of my steps. "I saw you by the lake earlier," the message said. My parents didn't even know I'd gone to the lake, and I definitely did not comment on the shed, much less on the way I did. The feeling of being watched intensified, and even trying to keep calm, I knew that something very wrong was going on. With each new message, the discomfort grew. I started to wonder if I was imagining things, but those descriptions were too accurate to be a coincidence. As far as I knew, there were no cameras on my parents' property, and nobody but us was around. While I tried to rationalize everything, my phone vibrated again. "There's something you forgot in the shed," said the message. A feeling of terror took hold of me. Whoever it was knew exactly where I was and what I did all day. After that last message, a part of me wanted to leave everything behind and go as soon as possible. But the other part, curious or perhaps disoriented by fear, made me take a lantern and go out again to the forest. My parents asked where I was going, and I made up some excuse, saying that I wanted to take a last ride before dark. Deep down, I knew that was not a good idea, but something pulled me back to that shed, as if only then I could understand what was happening. I walked back along the trail, and everything seemed more sinister, as if the forest had gained a life of its own, silent and heavy. With each step, I felt a mixture of fear and hurry to get to the shed and end that feeling of being observed. When I finally arrived, I hesitated for a moment before entering. The flashlight only illuminated the basics, and the shadows seemed even more intense and scary inside. The air was so dense that it was almost hard to breathe, and a part of me wanted to turn around and run away from there. But something kept me going. I looked around, trying to see what I had supposedly forgotten. At first, nothing seemed different. The children's shoes, the dry leaves on the floor, and the drawings on the walls were still there. It was then that the light of the lantern hit a piece of paper yellowed, folded, half hidden between the shoes. I picked up the paper carefully, as if it could explode in my hands. When I unfolded it, I realized that it was a picture. It was a photo of me taken recently, probably that same day. Seeing that picture was like a punch in the stomach. I could barely understand how it was possible. The image was a little blurry, but it was clearly me, wearing the same clothes that day, walking through the forest. In the background, I could see my parents' house from afar. I stood there trying to process it, and my heart felt like it was coming out of my mouth. It was as if someone had followed my every step, documented every move without even suspecting. And then an inevitable question came to me: who was doing this and why? The feeling of being watched was unbearable. I left the shed as fast as I could, without looking back. My mind was spinning in 1,000 theories, but none seemed to make sense. As I walked back, every time a branch snapped, I looked over my shoulder, hoping to see someone following me, but I saw nothing. When I finally got back to the house, I ran inside and locked the door. As much as I tried to calm myself down, I knew that that photo, that shed and all those messages were a sign that something very wrong was happening. After I locked the door, I sat down and tried to take a deep breath, but my mind did not stop. The messages, the shed, the photo, everything seemed a kind of sick game. Took my phone and decided to block the number, thinking that this might end the situation. But the truth is that I no longer felt safe even inside. With every noise out there, my imagination created even worse scenarios, and the fear of someone being there, watching me, was suffocating. A few minutes later, my phone vibrated again. I looked, hoping it was some friend or a distraction, but it was more of a message from that number. This time, the message said, "I think you know now that I'm always around. It's done with me." It was as if whoever was playing with my fear, having fun with my reaction. At that moment, I realized that I had no way to ignore the situation. I got up and went straight to my parents, telling them everything that had happened, from the shed to the messages. They were shocked, but tried to calm me down, saying that maybe it was someone in the city doing a joke of bad taste. Still, my father decided it was better to go around the property, see if he could find any clues. As he left, my mother and I were silent, trying to understand what it meant. Minutes later, my father came back saying he had found nothing suspicious. But that night, the silence of the house seemed much heavier than usual, as if the atmosphere itself was loaded with something dark. I tried to sleep, but the fear of getting another message or seeing someone through the window kept me alert. Deep down, I knew it wasn't over. When I finally managed to close my eyes, fatigue overcame me, but it was a light and restless sleep. I woke up to every noise of the house, imagining the worst. By 3 o'clock in the morning, my phone vibrated again, and the panic came back. I took the device with trembling hands and saw a new message. She said only, "See you tomorrow." Just those 2 words, but enough to take away any rest of tranquility. The feeling of impotence, not knowing who was doing it or what he wanted to do, was unbearable. I spent the rest of the morning sitting in bed, looking at my phone and the window waiting for dawn. When the sun finally came out, I dressed myself and decided that I needed to get out of there as soon as possible. I told my parents that I had to go back to the city that same day. I made up some excuse, and they, noticing my state, did not insist that I stay. To this day, I don't know who sent me those messages or what was expected of me, but the fear and the strangeness of that experience remain with me, like a memory that never goes away. Between silences and secrets, the hidden truth in a rural house. I have been working as a social worker for more than a decade, and in these years I have seen everything. Cases of abuse, neglect, and even risky situations that I did not know existed. However, nothing made me as restless as the family I met last year. They lived in a rural area, half removed, with an old house surrounded by trees and a rusty fence. It was a mother, father, and daughter of about 10 years old, apparently an ordinary family, but something always seemed strange to me when I visited them. My job was to make monthly visits to check the well-being of the daughter, who had delayed school development and socialization difficulties. On my first visit, I noticed a missing sign affixed to a pole near the dirt road leading to their house. The photo showed a girl with dark hair and big eyes, and although it was slightly worn by time, it was very visible. The girl on the poster looked familiar to me, but I couldn't remember where. I left it aside and went to the house to meet the family. When I arrived, the reception was different. The mother looked at me with a tense smile, the father barely spoke, and the daughter hardly left near the mother. On subsequent visits, the missing girl's poster was still there, always intact, as if no one dared to remove it. Every time I passed by him, something inside me was disturbed, especially when I entered the house and saw their daughter sitting quietly in a corner or glued to her mother. The girl had a frightening resemblance to the one on the poster. At first, I thought it was just my head. Maybe it was influencing me by working with so many difficult cases. But the more I looked, the more that face looked the same, with the same big eyes and the same dark hair. Once, I tried to ask about the poster for the mother, casually mentioning that I always saw it on the road. She just gave a short, uncomfortable smile and looked away. It was as if an invisible wall stood between us. The father also always seemed distant, staring at a point on the ground or avoiding eye contact. Nobody talked much, and the few answers I could get were vague and without details. I began to feel that there was something more there, but at the same time, I had no concrete evidence, and this made me even more uneasy. In one of the visits, I decided to observe more closely the behavior of the girl. She always seemed nervous, looking at the parents before answering any question I asked. That day, as the mother was leaving the room to get something, I tried to talk with her. I asked about the school, about friends, trying to understand a little more of her life. The girl looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and fear, as if trying to understand how far she could speak. When I mentioned the word friends, she lowered her head and was silent. The tension was palpable, and as soon as the mother returned to the room, the girl ran to her side and grabbed her hand. That left me intrigued. I knew that children with socialization difficulties are usually shy, but there was something different in the way she reacted. Instead of being a common fear, it seemed more like a caution, as if she was being directed not to talk to me much. That same afternoon, while I was returning home, I decided to stop and examine the missing persons poster more carefully. I could not help the shiver that I felt when I noticed that the similarity between the two was practically perfect. After that day, I started thinking constantly about the case. Everything seemed strange, and the way the parents behaved made me feel that they were hiding something. I decided to look for information about the missing persons poster, so I went to the local police station, trying to find out if they had any record of the case. The police officer who answered me said he remembered the girl on the sign. She had disappeared about 5 years ago, and the case was never solved. Her family was from a nearby town, and after the disappearance, her parents moved out. He mentioned that the police had even searched, but over time, the clues cooled and the case was closed. I left the police station with a weight on my chest. With each visit, the idea that the girl in that family could be the same as the poster became stronger. Still, it was a serious accusation, and I knew I needed more evidence before anything. On the next visit, I decided to observe everything with even more attention, especially the girl. Any detail could make a difference, and I couldn't ignore that feeling that something was very wrong. When I arrived at their house on that visit, I realized the atmosphere was more tense than usual. The mother seemed nervous and constantly looked at the clock, as if she wanted me to leave as soon as possible. The girl was sitting in a corner, with a notebook on her lap, scribbling something, but without making any noise. I decided to approach her and ask what she was drawing. She showed a drawing of a house with trees around, very simple, but what caught my attention were small traces in the background, which seemed to be people. I asked who they were, and she just answered, almost in a whisper, "My friends." The way she said that made me cold. It was the first time I mentioned friends, and the tone of voice seemed sad, almost like a distant memory. The mother quickly approached and took the notebook from the hands of the girl, saying that it was time for lunch and that I could accompany her daughter to the kitchen. As we walked, the girl looked at me with an expression I could not decipher, something between fear and a silent cry for help. At that moment, I knew I had to do something. As soon as I got to the kitchen with the girl, her mother started preparing the snack, but she kept a close eye on me. I took a moment when she turned her back and whispered to the girl, "You know you can tell me anything, right? I'm here to help you." She just looked at me, and for a second, I thought she was going to say something, but then I heard the sound of Dad coming into the kitchen. He gave me a cold look, and that brief moment of complicity with the girl was immediately undone. She looked away and was quiet, and I realized that my presence was beginning to bother them more than usual. At that moment, I knew it was better to end the visit, but I left there with the certainty that I had to report this to the authorities, even if it seemed a vague suspicion. He did not want to let it pass, knowing that the resemblance with the missing girl was real and that her behavior showed signs of fear. As soon as I arrived at the office, I made a full report on the case, describing every detail of the visits and requesting an investigation. A few days later, I received a call informing me that a team of investigators would visit the family to investigate the situation. I confess that I was relieved and anxious at the same time. I wanted to know the truth, but I was afraid of what they might find. During the week, I avoided thinking too much about the case, but curiosity was immense. Finally, a colleague who was following the process called me to say that the team had paid a visit, but that the parents were cooperative and claimed that it was all just a coincidence. However, the most disturbing detail was that, according to my colleague, the girl I described was not in the house on the day of the visit. The parents claimed that she had gone to spend time with relatives in another city, and the investigation was eventually shelved for lack of evidence. I tried to argue that it was too strange to ignore, but they told me that without hard evidence there was no way to continue the case. Since then, that case has never left my head. I was tormented for weeks, reliving every visit, every look, every detail that I noticed in the house. I still wonder if that girl really was who I thought she was, or if somehow it was all just a bizarre coincidence. But what bothers me the most is the feeling that I missed something, that maybe I could have done more. I try to get back to my routine, but every time I see a child with a lost look or a family with strange behaviors, I'm taken back to that case. Even today, I sometimes dream of that dirt road with the yellowed poster on the pole and the gloomy house of that family. I never received information about them again, and whenever I ask at the office, they say that the family moved right after the last visit of the team. The missing girls poster was also removed. I don't know what happened to them, but a part of me still wonders if that girl is safe, wherever she is. Footprints in the darkness, a haunted camp. I have always been passionate about camping, especially in remote places where you can really feel the tranquility of nature. That was the case when I decided on a Friday afternoon to take my dog Thor and camp in a forest that was a few miles from the city. The idea was to spend the night there, just me and him, enjoying the sound of the wind and that peace that only the middle of nowhere can offer. I prepared everything: tent, lanterns, supplies, and the essentials to spend the night. We arrived there still in the day, enough to choose a good place and set up camp. Thor was excited, running around and sniffing everything. He is a super smart German shepherd and is always aware of any movement. When the sun started to set, I made a fire and sat watching the stars that appeared slowly. The forest was dense, and silence took over everything except for the sound of wood crackling on the fire and Thor walking from side to side, sniffing. The night seemed perfect, but after 11 o'clock, the fire began to go out, and I decided it was time to go into the tent and rest. As soon as I entered the tent and settled into the sleeping bag, Thor was outside, lying near the entrance. He usually does this every time we camp, as if he was guarding the camp. But suddenly, in the middle of absolute silence, he began to growl softly. I thought it was some small animal passing by, normal thing in the forest. Ignored and tried to relax again, but the growl of Thor became more intense, and then he started barking, short and low barks, like he only does when he notices something strange. Immediately I got up and left the tent, trying to understand what was bothering Thor. The lantern was in my hand, and I lit up the surrounding ground, looking for any sign of movement. Thor was with his hair all ridden, staring at a point in the darkness. I followed his look with the light of the lantern, and although I saw nothing immediately, the feeling that something was there made me feel a shiver in my spine. As I looked around, trying to understand what was happening, Thor remained restless, circling the camp with his gaze fixed in the darkness. It was then that I noticed something strange on the ground, just at the edge of the area that lit with the flashlight. They were footprints, small and well-defined, as if they were of a child. That did not make the least sense. We were in the middle of nowhere, and I was sure that there was no one else camping around. I bent down to look closer, and the more I watched, the sharper the marks. It was as if a child were walking around the camp. I followed the footprints with the lantern and realized that they surrounded our camp, forming an almost perfect circle around the tent and the fire. Thor was now silent, but alert, with his eyes fixed towards the trees, as if he were waiting for something to emerge from there at any moment. That left me in a state of total alertness. I tried to rationalize, thinking that it was perhaps some animal, but the footprints were unmistakable, small and with the exact shape of human feet. Following the footprints with the flashlight was one of the strangest things I ever did. They went around the camp and at one point began to move away, entering the forest. The idea of someone or something with such small feet walking around in the middle of the night caused me a chill in my stomach, but a kind of irrational curiosity led me to follow the trail for a few meters into the forest. Thor came right behind, without leaving my side, but growling low, as if he did not like anything we were doing. After about 15 meters, the footprints simply disappeared. It was as if the child who left them had vanished into thin air. I looked around, pointing the lantern everywhere, but the darkness seemed to swallow any trace of light. The silence was dense, almost palpable, and you could only hear the heavy breath of Thor next to me. Feeling that sudden emptiness where the footprints disappeared left me a bad feeling, as if it was a warning not to go ahead. I decided it was better to go back to camp and try to forget about that weird situation. Thor was still tense, but seemed relieved when we started walking back to the tent. When we arrived, I sat in the entrance, with the lantern by my side and Thor lying next to me, still attentive to every noise. Even without any more footprints, The feeling that there was something there, watching us, was too strong to be ignored. I kept looking at the darkness, as if at any moment I would see something moving among the trees. Time passed slowly, and every little sound of the forest made my heart race. I had camped so many times that I thought I was used to the silence and natural noises of the night, but that night everything seemed different. There was something else, something that I could not see or understand completely. Even trying to convince me that it was only my mind playing tricks, the tension was constant, as if the whole forest was stuck in that same strangeness I felt when I found those footprints. After a while, I decided to try to sleep, even with that sense of alertness. I went into the tent and pulled Thor inside too, something he never did, but that night it seemed to me the right thing. He settled down beside me, but was moving restless, as if he was waiting for something. I turned off the flashlight and tried to relax, but my heart kept racing, and any noise outside made my breath hold. By dawn, I heard a subtle noise, with the leaves being trampled, right near the tent. Thor started growling softly again, and I was completely still listening. It seemed like someone or something was walking around the tent, very slowly. My first impulse was to take the lantern and light up outside, but the fear of seeing whatever it was paralyzed me. I could only hear that sound of gentle, almost cautious steps, moving away and then approaching again. I stood there, holding my breath, listening to the sound of those weak steps that surrounded the tent. Thor growled quietly, but remained motionless, as if he understood that any movement of ours could attract whatever was out there. At one point, the sound stopped very close to my side of the tent, and I could hear a low, irregular breath, almost like a whisper coming from the other side of the fabric. It left me frozen. It was as if something was waiting for me to react in some way. I couldn't think of anything but to keep quiet and hope that it would go away. Time seemed to drag, and that light sound of straggled steps began to distance itself again. Finally, everything was silent again. Waited as long as I could until the day dawned, without being able to close my eyes for a second. As soon as the first ray of sunshine came out, I gathered courage to leave the tent. Thor walked with me, still cautious, sniffing around the ground. My first reaction was to look at the place where I had heard those steps and breathing during the early morning. And there they were again, the same small, sharp footprints, as if someone had walked around the tent all night. The marks went to a specific point near the trees, and then disappeared in the direction they came from the night before, suddenly disappearing. With everything tidy, I put Thor in the car and took a last look at the forest. The sun already illuminated the place, but that space, before so familiar, seemed to have become something sinister and unknown. The idea that someone or something was so close to my tent and disappeared without a trace still gives me shivers. When I returned to the city, I thought about telling some friends what happened, but I knew that the story seemed absurd. After all, who would believe that I found footprints of children in the middle of nowhere, surrounding my camp? Since that day, I never went back to that forest, and Thor, always so excited for adventures, also looks different near more isolated areas. Every time I remember that night, I feel a shiver in my spine and a strange feeling, as if it was still watching me from afar, waiting to appear again if I dared to return. It all started as a simple exploration between friends. I've always been fascinated by history, especially places that preserve a piece of the past, and when I heard about an abandoned old military bunker a few miles from our city, I thought it would be a perfect adventure. I invited two friends, Lucas and Ricardo, who always met any stop, and we left on a Saturday afternoon. The bunker was isolated, hidden between trees and rocky terrain, but after some time of walking we managed to find it. The entrance was partially blocked, as if someone had tried to prevent access, but we were able to push the stones that obstructed it and enter. The first thing I felt when I stepped inside was the smell of moisture and rusty metal, a smell that seemed old, almost as if it was impregnated by memories of everything that has happened there. The structure was small, with narrow corridors leading to small empty rooms, some with broken furniture, others with papers scattered on the floor. There was a strange silence in there, the kind of silence that makes your own footsteps louder and make the sound echo on the walls. Everything seemed perfectly abandoned and intact, until Lucas found a notebook in a corner, hidden under a layer of thick dust. It was a diary with the old cover, and had an old date, more than 70 years. We flipped through some pages and realized that the content was bizarre. The author seemed to be a soldier, someone who was confined there during some critical moment of the war, and his notes were disturbing. He described shadows that hunted in the dark, something he claimed was more than hallucinations of fatigue. The soldier was convinced that these shadows were real and that they attacked when he and his most vulnerable companions were alone. As we read the diary, the atmosphere of curiosity gave way to a growing discomfort. The soldier's notes were increasingly confusing, but there was an urgency in his words, as if he was trying to warn anyone who could find the diary. He spoke about not being fooled by silence and never looking directly at shadows. It was hard to know how real that was, or the result of a mind on the verge of collapse, but something in those words bothered me deeply. Ricardo, who was always the most skeptical, laughed and said that the soldier must be delirious. Lucas agreed, trying to ease the tension, but I couldn't stop thinking about the fear that those words conveyed. It was as if somehow the soldier was still stuck there, fighting something invisible. We decided to keep exploring, but with each new corridor, my mind turned to the descriptions in the diary. I had the feeling that the bunker was getting colder and darker too as we moved forward, even if in reality nothing had changed. After a while, we realized that we had distanced ourselves from each other. I called for Richard and Luke, and they answered from somewhere further on. Their voice echoed strangely on the walls, as if the sound was distorted. When we met again, I realized that Ricardo was with an uncomfortable look, something I rarely saw in him. I asked if it was all right, and he just nodded, but without conviction. Something in that place was starting to affect us all, even if we didn't want to admit it. As we explore the bunker more, we begin to feel a strange pressure in the air, as if the environment is heavy. At times, we all heard muffled noises, like slow and distant steps. Initially, we thought it might be some echo of our own movements, but the sounds came from places where none of us were. Each tried to disguise the nervousness, but it was clear that everyone was apprehensive. At one point, we found a room with the ceiling partially collapsed, full of debris. While we were analyzing the place, Lucas found another loose page, apparently taken from the diary that we had seen before. In it, the soldier made a fast and almost illegible note, as if he had written hastily, "The shadows are getting closer. Avoid the corridor to the north after dark." It was a direct and almost absurd warning, but something in those words seemed to be a practical instruction, as if he was sure of what he was saying. That phrase made something in me to light, a strange and instinctive fear that I could not ignore. I told the others about leaving, but Ricardo and Lucas laughed, saying that we should not get carried away by an old and paranoid diary. Even so, the tension was stamped on their faces, however much they tried to play with the situation. The clock was ticking late in the afternoon, and we realized that without windows around, darkness was taking over the bunker faster than we thought. We decided to leave and end the exploration, but it was when we approached the exit that we realized that Ricardo was no longer with us. We called him by the name of Ricardo several times, but silence was the only answer. Me and Lucas exchanged a nervous look, not knowing if he had lost or was playing a trick on us. We decided to retrace our steps, going back through the dark corridors, but now everything seemed more confused, as if the bunker had changed. The cold was increasing as we went, and Lucas's flashlight began to fail, blinking and decreasing in intensity. I felt a squeeze in my chest and an instinct to leave at any cost, but I could not abandon Ricardo. As we moved, I heard fast steps, as if someone was running in some nearby corridor, but no matter how much we looked, we saw no one. Lucas started to panic, holding the flashlight steady, and I felt my own breath accelerate. Finally, we found the spot where we had last seen Ricardo. On the floor, scattered around, were more pages of the diary, but now they had disturbing notes like "they observe" and "do not trust the voices." What was even stranger is that, on one of the pages, there was a hand mark, as if someone had held it tightly just before leaving it there. I knew in that something was seriously wrong and we needed to leave, but the idea of leaving Ricardo behind filled me with guilt and fear. Lucas began to whisper desperately that we needed to get out of there, and I confess that for a moment I thought I would agree with him. The feeling of being observed was almost physical, and every shadow in the corners seemed to move, as if they were the shadows that hunt that the diary mentioned. As we tried to figure out what to do, we heard something that froze my blood, the voice of Richard calling our names from a point further. The sound was weak, almost muffled, but unmistakable. Without thinking much, we run towards the call, but as we turn the corridor, we only face more darkness and nothing of Ricardo. It was as if he was moving further forward each time we tried to reach him. Lost among corridors that no longer looked the same as when we entered, we arrived in an empty and dark room. On the floor, spread out as if they had been left on purpose, there were more pages of the diary. In one of them, the words were crossed out, but it was still possible to read a phrase that scares me even today. The shadows use their voice against you. At that moment, I realized that the voice we heard was probably not Ricardo. Lucas seemed in shock, mumbling that it couldn't be happening, and for the first time I felt a genuine despair to get out of there, to leave everything and run. Taking a deep breath and trying to ignore the panic that was dominating me, I pulled Lucas by the arm and said we needed to leave immediately, with or without Ricardo. He hesitated, but when he saw my despair, he nodded in silence. We took the fastest way back as we could, practically running through the narrow and cold corridors. It was as if the bunker was pushing us out. Each echo of our steps seemed to mix with other sounds, steps that were not ours, whispers that seemed to arise from concrete itself. When we finally saw the faint flash of the entrance, it was like an intense relief, but at the same time a sense of guilt for leaving Ricardo behind. As we crossed the exit and felt the cold, humid air of the forest, we crumbled on the ground, panting and stunned. We stood there for a while, without saying anything, trying to absorb what had just happened. After a few minutes, Lucas began to cry, repeating that we should return, that we could not leave Ricardo there. But deep down, we both knew that coming back wasn't an option. That feeling of something inhuman was inside the bunker, something that played with our mind, made me decide that, however difficult it was, we needed professional help to find Ricardo. As soon as we returned to the city, we went straight to the police station and told everything, trying, in the midst of despair, to make sense of what we had witnessed. The police looked at us with suspicion, but after much insistence, they agreed to organize a search for Ricardo. They left with lanterns and equipment, but after hours of searching the bunker and surroundings, returned without any sign of him. They said the place was empty, that there was no evidence of anyone hiding or any recent movement, other than our footprints. It was as if Richard had never entered there. The following days were strange. I came home with a weight that seemed to increase every hour, and the feeling of guilt mixed with a sense of something wrong that did not abandon me. It was then that I found the first page of the diary in my room, on the table. I thought it was some kind of hallucination, or maybe Lucas had left that as a joke. But when I tried to ask, I realized he was also in shock and did not remember having taken anything from there. In the days that followed, more pages began to appear around the house. Some appeared on the floor of my room, others in the living room, and even in the bathroom. The notes on them were the same as we had read in the bunker. Warnings about the shadows, about the dangers of silence, and the recommendation to never look directly at them. Each new page seemed to come out of nowhere, and the feeling of being watched grew every day. I started to sleep badly, always waking up in the middle of the night with the impression that there was someone or something standing in the dark corners of my room. One night, I woke up overwhelmed with one of the pages stuck in my hand. It was wrinkled, as if it had been pressed tightly, and in the darkness I read the words, "They come to him who carries fear." It made me scared. It seemed like a direct warning. Suddenly, everything made sense. It was as if whatever was in that bunker had followed me, somehow crossing into my home. Since then, the pages have stopped appearing, but the fear has not gone away. Even today I feel that there is something with me, a presence that I cannot explain, and the last thing I want to go back to that place. Cartoons in the dark truth behind the walls. It was last year that this story began, and even today I wonder why I decided to go after that legend. I am a teacher of a school for elementary education in a very small town. It was an old school, one that exudes the smell of old wood, and most residents have some story to tell. On a Friday, during a conversation between colleagues, one of the older teachers commented on an old rumor of a secret basement hidden in a school building that had been closed years ago. They said that some children many years ago had seen strange things down there, but no one took it seriously. I thought it was just another one of those small town stories, but for some reason that legend made me curious. The school was a typical old brick building with wide and always dark corridors, especially in the old building. I used to teach in the new wing, but that closed wing always caught my attention when I passed by. So after hearing about the legend, I decided to take a look around. I know it sounds silly, but the idea that there could be a hidden cellar full of secrets stirred my curiosity. I waited until the end of the day, when the school was practically empty. I walked through the halls until I realized there was no one else around, and then went to the old wing where few have ventured since it was closed. I entered the closed ward with a certain fear, but curiosity was stronger. The corridors were narrower and darker, and the sound of my steps echoed in a strange way, as if the building itself was absorbing the sound. The lighting was almost non-existent, because the windows were covered with dust and some with boards nailed, leaving the environment even more gloomy. I walked slowly, trying to remember the stories they had told me, until I reached a small door of worn wood, hidden at the end of a corridor. It seemed that no one had opened that door for decades, and I thought that could be the entrance to this basement. I took a deep breath and turned the handle, which rang a high, almost like a scream. When the door finally opened, it revealed a concrete staircase that descended to what appeared to be a lower floor. The temperature immediately dropped, and a strong smell of mold and damp earth invaded my nostrils. That latter seemed to invite me down, even with all the signs that I should do the opposite. Took my phone and turned on the flashlight, lighting the steps covered with dust and cobwebs. I started to descend slowly, with a growing feeling that something was waiting for me down there. As I went down, each step seemed heavier, as if the air became dense and enveloped me in a kind of suffocating fog. The dim light of my phone could barely illuminate more than a few steps ahead, and the feeling that something was watching me became even more intense. At the end of the stairs, I came across a long and narrow corridor with concrete walls that seemed to breathe the humidity of the environment. My steps echoed, and with each advance, the silence around became more disturbing. The only thing that interrupted the sound of my steps was the light dripping of water coming from somewhere in the corridor. While exploring the space, I noticed something strange on the walls. At first glance, they seemed just old doodles, marks that time could have left, but as I illuminated better, I realized that they were drawings. They were small, childish figures, but not ordinary drawings of happy children. They showed figures running, some hiding behind shapes that reminded doors, and others seemed to be lying down, with traces that suggest fear or despair. My heart began to speed as I tried to understand why these images were there, and a feeling of discomfort took hold of me. I continued walking down the corridor, unable to look away from those drawings. The further I went, the more they seemed to come to life, as if each one told a story or represented a scene of something that actually happened there. There was a bizarre pattern between the figures. In some drawings I could see small figures, like children, being followed by shadows. These shadows had no definite shape, but seemed more dark and distorted, almost like figures moving in a threatening way. I knew that I had to go back, that nothing good would come from staying in that basement, but it was as if something was holding me there. Suddenly, I heard a distant sound, like something dragging heavy on the ground. Froze in place, holding the phone tightly while the light trembled slightly. I tried to convince myself that the sound was just an old pipe, some normal noise from an old building, but the noise continued, now closer. It was as if someone was moving, well, slowly, down the same corridor where I was. My heart shot, and I felt the cold sweat coming down my back, but something in me could not move. After a few seconds, I created courage and turned to look where the sound came from, lighting the corridor with the cell phone flashlight. There was nothing. The silence took over again the environment, but that drag still echoed in my head, as if it was engraved there. Again I walked, with cautious steps, determined to find the exit. It was then that, while lighting a wall on my left, I saw another series of drawings, but these were different. They were figures of adults and children, all drawn with faces facing back, as if they were looking at something or someone who followed them. It made me even more terrified, and I knew I had to get out of there anyway. I started walking faster, with my breathing accelerated, but the more I tried to move away, the more it seemed that the corridor extended. It seemed that I was walking in circles, or that the basement was turning into a maze. It was at this moment that, behind me, I heard footsteps echoing, not dragged as before, but steady and constant, as if someone was accompanying me. Without thinking twice, I started running, ignoring the weight of the air and the smell of mold that seemed to intensify with each step. The steps behind me also accelerated, and as much as I tried to rationalize, there was no way to deny that someone or something was following me. The cell phone's flashlight was shaking, and my mind was divided between the desire to look back and the fear of finding out what might be there. My instincts were screaming to keep going, so I kept looking at the way ahead, desperately waiting for the end of the corridor to come soon. Finally, I saw the ladder. It was like a glimmer of hope in the middle of that suffocating darkness. Without stopping, I climbed the steps in pairs, without daring to look down, with the horrible feeling that at any moment a cold hand could grab my ankle. When I reached the top and left the corridor, I closed the door behind me with all the strength I could muster, leaning my body against it as I tried to catch my breath. The silence came back, but it was different, a lighter silence, without the oppressive presence that I felt down there. As I took my breath, I felt a wave of relief mixed with disbelief, trying to assimilate what had just happened. The door leading to the basement now looked like an old and harmless entrance, but I knew something sinister was hidden down there. When I finally moved away from the door, my mind was still trying to understand if what I lived was real or just an effect of the suggestion of an urban legend. Every sound, every step I heard down there seemed to be part of a psychological trap, but the images I saw on the walls were impossible to ignore. I decided to leave the old wing and return to the active part of the school, where everything seemed safe and familiar. I walked quickly through the halls, and a sense of relief took hold of me as soon as I left the building. Only then I realized how cold my hands were and how fast my heart was still beating. That experience seemed almost unreal, but I knew I had seen and heard things that I could not explain. Deep down, the idea that maybe someone had really lived something dark in that basement decades ago left me with an unexplainable weight. I spent the rest of the day trying to focus on my tasks, but the experience of the basement continued to haunt me. The faces in the drawings, the sound of steps, the dense air, everything remained in my mind like a nightmare to which I was still stuck. That night, when I came home, I thought about telling someone, but I knew anyone would find all this nonsense. I decided to write down what happened, more as a way of processing fear than to record something concrete. I sat with a notebook and pen, still with that feeling that somehow I was not alone. When I started writing, I noticed something strange. My handwriting seemed irregular, shaky, as if my hand was still scared. I wrote about the shadows, the drawings on the walls, and the sound of steps. However, when I got to the step part behind me, I started hearing a low sound in the room, a sound of very light steps, almost imperceptible, but that seemed to resonate with every word I wrote down. I felt the air around me weigh again, and that same sense of presence came back, as if I had brought something from the basement to my home. I froze, holding the pen tightly as the steps seemed to approach. The house was silent, and I knew that I was alone, but that sound persisted, as if something invisible was walking slowly through the room. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, the fear making me imagine things. Even so, every fiber of my body told me that it was not just imagination. The presence there was almost palpable, and the air became as heavy as that of the basement, leaving me with my breath stuck. In a rush, I got up and started searching the house, turning on all the lights, checking every corner, every shadow. But there was nothing, no sign of anyone else, no sound beyond my beating heart and the silence of the house. I decided that the best was to get out of there for a while, breathe some fresh air. As soon as I opened the door and stepped out, the feeling disappeared, as if it was just an echo of what I had brought with me from the basement. I looked at the house, and as much as I knew that there was nothing physical there, that feeling that something would follow me still persisted. After that night, the feeling of being observed never completely disappeared. I avoided talking about what had happened, but colleagues noticed that I was different. Some even asked if I was okay, but I was talking out of my mind, not knowing how to explain it in a way that didn't sound insane. The worst part is that even with all efforts to forget, the sound of the steps began to appear at random moments. Sometimes I heard those steps while I was teaching, other times in the empty hallway of the school. It was as if that presence had stuck to me from the moment I left that basement. One day, when I was setting up my desk, I found a piece of paper that I did not remember having left there. It was a crumpled piece, covered with a thin layer of dust, and when I opened it, I saw a drawing similar to those in the basement. Small figures holding hands and a shadow at the bottom. The idea that that piece of paper could have come from the basement, and worse yet, that it had appeared there without explanation, left me paralyzed. I tried to convince myself that someone could have put the paper there as a joke, but deep down I knew that it had no simple explanation. After finding the drawing, I realized that I needed to do something to remove that presence. I avoided the old school wing as much as I could, but still, the sensations and sounds kept haunting me. I started to hear the steps at home, especially during the night, always in the same slow and constant rhythm, as if something was watching my every movement. Some nights I woke up with the feeling that someone was standing next to my bed, but when I looked around, I only saw ordinary shadows. But these shadows seemed denser, as if they were watching me, and the air in the house became almost unbearable from being so heavy. On impulse, I decided to go back to the school building where it all started. It was as if somehow it was waiting for a closure. I went back to the basement door, this time with the intention of leaving anything that I had brought with me. Held the piece of paper with the drawing, and went down the stairs, with my heart beating. When I got to the hall, I left the paper on the floor, almost as an apology, and turned to leave. All the time, I felt like someone was right behind me, but for the first time, I ignored the feeling and moved on. As I went up the stairs, a strange peace took hold of me, and since then my steps have ceased, as if that presence had finally been left behind, from where it should never have left. Terror in the farm, shady farm, secrets in the country house. As soon as I moved into that farmhouse, I felt a mixture of peace and freedom that I had never felt before. It was an ancient place, dark and heavy wood, surrounded by fields and trees, far from any noise of the city. I was 28 years old, and as an artist, I used to look for inspiration for my work. I felt that isolation would do me good, that being surrounded by nature and silence would help me to immerse myself in my painting. My days were busy with long work sessions in the improvised studio I set up in the living room, where my easel and paint spread on the floor. I used to paint until late at night, lulling the silence of the house with the low music that came out of my phone. In the first days, everything was perfect. The house was a bit old, but it seemed safe and cozy. I began to get used to the sound of wood cracking at dawn and the distant sound of wind beating in the windows. However, after a week I started to notice some strange things. Sometimes I found objects out of place, like my hair brush, which I always left in the dressing table, appearing in the bathroom, or the kitchen chair slightly away, when I was sure that I would leave it by the table. I thought I was just distracted, maybe too tired to remember the details. After all, I was spending hours focused on painting, so my mind could be playing tricks. But as the days went by, events began to intensify. One morning I realized my keys had gone. I have turned the whole house upside down, every corner, every drawer, without success. I was already giving up when, returning to the studio, I found the keys on my easel, in the middle of the paints. I thought it was strange, but I tried to convince myself that I had put them there and forgot. I started to be more attentive, taking care to leave everything in place and mentally note where I left each thing. But the situation only worsened. Other items keep moving, small objects like my favorite brush, even the kitchen chairs, which sometimes appeared on the other side of the table without explanation. It was on a particularly quiet afternoon that I realized I wasn't alone. I was painting for hours when I decided to take a break and went out for coffee. When I returned, I found a puzzling surprise. Someone or something had interfered with my work. There was a red spot right in the center of the canvas, as if a brush with red paint had been dragged over what I was painting. I would never have done that, and no one else had access to the house. The nervousness began to grow, but I still tried to ignore it, thinking that maybe I had left a dirty cloth on the painting without realizing. At night, I was thinking about the stain and the objects out of place. It was the first time I felt really uncomfortable at home. I tried to watch a movie to relax, but every time I looked at the easel, I felt increasing discomfort. I decided to go to sleep early, trying to ignore that restlessness, but at about 3 in the morning, I was awakened by a strange sound, like a slight whisper coming from the corridor. I sat in bed, holding my breath, trying to understand if it was the wind or some noise from the house. But the whisper continued, low and almost imperceptible, but real. It was as if someone murmured words I could not understand, just a few steps away. Stood up, trying to keep calm, and went down the hall to see if I could find anything out of the ordinary. There was nothing. I went back to the room and locked the door, but sleep did not come again. I was listening to the silence, tense, as if at any moment that whisper could start again. The house, which before seemed cozy, now seemed to hide something, as if it had an invisible presence. The next morning, I was already exhausted but determined not to be shaken by a series of coincidences. I decided to continue painting and ignore anything out of the ordinary. I set up the studio and started working, trying to focus on the canvas. But the feeling that someone was watching me grew as the hours passed. The house was strangely quiet, and the silence only made my anxiety increase. At one point, I went out to get more paint, and when I came back my heart almost stopped. There was a sentence written on my easel, with thick strokes of red paint. "Get out of here. Do not need to say how much I felt." It was the same paint I used, but the style was rough, strange, as if someone else had taken the brush. I looked around, trying to rationalize, but my mind was in chaos. There was no sign of invasion, and no one could have entered without me noticing. I tried to delete the message, but my hand was shaking so much that I almost knocked down the easel. It was as if the house were trying to expel me, making clear that my presence there was not welcome. After that message, I couldn't paint anymore. The idea that something or someone was trying to communicate so directly left me completely baffled. I spent the day walking around the house, checking every room, window, and door, trying to find some explanation for all that. At night, I decided to leave all the lights on and keep my phone by my side. I was alert to any noise, and every crack of the walls or movement of the wind left me in a state of alert. At about 2 o'clock in the morning, I heard footsteps outside the house, right next to the window of the room. Slowly I got up and went to the window, with my heart pounding, holding my breath so as not to make any noise. The steps continued, steady, dragged, as if someone was walking in circles around the house. I looked through the crack of the curtain, but saw no one. I stood there motionless, waiting for them to stop, but they kept on going from one window to another as if someone was surrounding me. At that moment, I realized it was no longer a matter of ignoring or trying to explain. Something was really happening, and I had no control over it. I took my phone and thought about calling the police, but I hesitated, wondering what he would say, which objects moved alone, who heard whispers, and that now there was someone around the house without leaving a trace. So I decided to just stay alert and wait for the dawn to pass. I curled up on the couch, holding my phone with the flashlight on, trying to keep calm and waiting for the sounds to stop. After a few minutes, the silence returned, and everything seemed calm again. I thought maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, until suddenly I heard a light knock on the window glass behind me. It was a precise beat, as if someone wanted to confirm your presence. My heart shot, and I was paralyzed, not knowing whether to turn to look or stand still. I took courage and turned slowly, pointing the cell phone flashlight to the window. The light revealed only the reflection of the room and the emptiness outside. There was nothing, but the feeling of being watched was intense, almost suffocating. I decided that I would not spend another night in that house. Gathered courage, went to the room and started packing a backpack with the basics to spend the rest of the night somewhere far away. As I threw things into my backpack, I noticed that the whispers had returned, low and distant but clearly audible. They seemed to come from the corridor, just like the night before, only this time they were closer. I closed the backpack quickly, trying to ignore the fear that already took hold of me. When I passed through the room, something made me glance at the easel. There was another message, now much larger and sharper, written with a still fresh ink. Last chance. That was enough to make me run out the front door, without looking back. As I stepped outside the house, I felt the fresh air like a huge relief, but the silence outside seemed as dense as what was inside. I walked quickly to the car, without looking at the windows, with the feeling that at any moment something could prevent me from leaving. I got into the car, turned on the engine with my trembling hands, and sped down the dirt road, without a clear idea of where to go, only with the desire to get as far away from that place as possible. When I arrived in town, I stopped at a parking lot and tried to process everything that had happened. As much as I tried to find an explanation, nothing seemed to make sense. The house was empty, like a mystery that I could never solve. After that day, I never came back. The feeling that this invisible presence was behind me, in a way, gave me peace. Even now, when I remember the messages and whispers, I feel a shiver, and the certainty that I made the right decision to leave. The camp that changed, unsolved mysteries in the park. As I started my tour that day, the landscape seemed as ordinary as any other working day. I work as a ranger in an isolated national park, known for both its beauty and the lack of cell phone signal and difficult trails. It was a remote area where visitors needed specific permission, and it was my job to make sure everything was in order and that no one was camping without registration. The truth is that I like this kind of isolation, the silence of the forest and the tranquility of the place. But that week, things started to change, and that peace became something else. At one point along the trail, I noticed signs of a recently set up camp, which left me on alert. When I got closer, I saw that there was a fire extinguished and some camping utensils scattered. It was not uncommon to find camps, but in this case there was something strange. The place was clearly occupied, but no one around. Usually, the smell of a burnt-out fire indicates that someone has been there in the last few hours. I reported the situation on the radio, only to hear my supervisor tell me that no one was allowed to camp in that area that week. It was a little worrying, since anyone camping without registration knew that they were breaking the rules. I searched the area looking for any trail, any indication that the buyer had gone out to explore, but all I found was a disconcerting silence. I have run the camp several times, analyzing every detail. There was a tent set up, very simple, with the zipper half open. Outside, I saw a backpack on the floor and a package of canned food still closed. The impression was that the person had left in a hurry, leaving everything behind, but there was no sign of footprints around, nor a visible trail to follow. The feeling that something was wrong became stronger. It was as if I was invading a space that should not be there. Finally, I decided to mentally mark the place and follow my rounds, promising myself to come back the next day to check. The next day, I walked straight to that point, hoping the camp had been dismantled or, who knows, meeting the supposed buyer to understand what was going on. When I arrived, however, I saw that the camp was in a different condition than I left. The canned food package was open, and the backpack, which had been on the ground before, was now leaning against the tent, as if someone had rearranged things. It was as if the owner had come back and moved around in the items, but disappeared again. I tried to contact my supervisor, but the communication was bad at that point, so I ran out of immediate answers. The feeling of restlessness increased. Even without direct contact with the supervisor, I decided that I could not leave it aside. Stood there for a while watching around, trying to pick up any movement or sound that would indicate someone was nearby. The forest was absurdly silent, more than normal, which only made my discomfort increase. I circled the area once more, trying to find some recent trail, some indication that the person had gone to explore the surroundings, but it was as if the buyer had simply disappeared. In the following days, I returned to the same point several times. Each time I arrived, I found the camp in a slightly different state. One morning I noticed that there were scraps of food scattered near the fire, and on another occasion the tent was partially closed, as if someone had tried to tidy it up and left in a hurry. The situation started to stir me in a strange way, and I began to feel a presence, as if someone was watching me from afar, hidden among the trees. I did not see anyone, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling that I was not alone. That afternoon, I decided I needed to investigate further. I returned to camp with a determination that mixed curiosity and a certain fear. Went straight to the tent, looking carefully inside. Everything was apparently normal, but there was something disturbingly wrong in the air. As last time, the backpack was there, with some personal belongings and food. However, there was now a new detail. A small lantern was positioned in a peculiar way on the ground, pointed directly out, as if someone had left it there to light the exit. While I was there, I started to hear a slight rustling in the trees nearby. I tried to ignore it, but the sound repeated itself with an unnatural consistency. Looked at the surrounding forest, focusing my vision on the shadows between the trees. My heart shot when I noticed, far away, an immobile figure, almost indistinct, hidden among the logs. You couldn't see his face or what he was doing there, but the presence was clear. I felt a chill in my spine, and for an instant, I was paralyzed, trying to understand if it was really someone or just my imagination. My instinct was to cry away, but curiosity held me in place. Kept my gaze fixed on that figure, which remained still, as if knowing that I had seen it. The air around seemed heavy, and every second seemed to drag. Finally, I created the courage to step back, slowly moving away from the camp, without taking my eyes off the direction where the figure was. As I moved, I realized that she also started moving, but not approaching me. Instead, she disappeared through the trees, slipping into a silence that made my heart go even faster. Turned around and came back down the trail as fast as I could, feeling like something was behind me, watching me until I was far away. When I got to an area with a little more signal, I reported everything I had seen to my supervisor, but he seemed incredulous, as if it was just another lost visitor or an illusion caused by the isolation of the place. Even so, he said he would send someone to check the area with me the next day, but that night the fear I felt leaving the camp made me think twice about whether I really wanted to go back to that place. The next morning, I met my supervisor at the agreed meeting point. He seemed a little skeptical, but at the same time curious, perhaps because I insisted so much on the story. We returned to camp together, and to my surprise and relief, he seemed to take the situation more seriously as we approached the site. When we arrived, the camp was different again. The tent, which was assembled before, was now completely disassembled, as if someone had decided to pack everything and leave for good. My supervisor looked around, perplexed, and even seemed to understand that something was not right. The fire, which was once extinguished, was now turned over, as if someone had recently stepped on the ashes. On top of a nearby stone, there was an open food package, something I definitely had not seen in previous visits. The strangest thing was to find fresh footprints around the place, small and irregularly distributed, as if the person had circled the tent several times before disappearing. My supervisor looked at the place in silence, with an expression I had not seen before, a mixture of worry and confusion. When I commented on the figure I saw in the trees the day before, he was silent for a moment and finally said that years ago an incident involving a lost camper had occurred in that particular area of the park. No one knew what had happened to the man, but his camp was found in similar circumstances, as if he had left in a hurry and disappeared without a trace. This story made the cold in my spine even more. I stood still looking around, and it was then that I felt, once again, the same feeling of being observed. It was then that I heard the familiar rustling coming from the trees, the same sound that paralyzed me last time. I felt my whole body be on alert, and realized that my supervisor had heard too. He quickly turned towards the noise, trying to identify the source, but as before, we can't see anything but shadows between the trees. The feeling of being observed became even more intense, as if the whole forest was surrounding us, attentive to each movement. My supervisor, usually a calm and experienced man, began to show nervousness, and I realized that he was also uncomfortable with the situation. Without much choice, we decided to leave the camp and slowly move away, keeping our eyes on the surroundings. As we moved away, the sound of the steps seemed to follow us, echoing in a strange and unsettled rhythm. When we finally got far enough away from the camp, silence returned, but discomfort remained. That presence seemed to still be watching us, hidden in the forest, like a shadow that only manifested when we were too close. When we returned to the base, the supervisor advised me to avoid that area for a few days, suggesting that perhaps the isolation and the park conditions had messed with my head. But I knew what we saw was real. The footprints, the objects that seemed to move by themselves, and that invisible presence. None of it was a product of my imagination. Even so, I tried to follow the instructions and focus on other parts of the park, hoping that time would help me forget what happened. However, The episode was not only in memory. Days later, I found a small ash mark at the entrance of the base, as if someone had set up a fire and left traces behind. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling that something from the camp was following me only increased. I felt that it was not over, that the presence was still near, waiting for the right time to manifest again. The days passed, and despite avoiding that area of the park, the feeling of being observed persisted. I saw shadows in the corner of my eyes, heard small noises like breaking branches or light steps in the bush, even in areas where there were no visitors. Every time I was alone in the middle of the forest, the weight of that presence came back. One morning, as I left the base for the round, I found, to my complete astonishment, a small piece of cloth stuck in a bush near the road. It was the same color and material of the tent that I saw at the mysterious camp. That discovery rekindled the fear I was trying to suppress. The piece of cloth seemed like a warning, as if it was not confined to the campsite, but was following me, moving along the park boundaries. I looked around, hoping to see something, but the forest was, as always, in a heavy silence. Knowing that I could not ignore it, I decided to report everything again to the supervisor. He listened carefully, but in the end only recommended that I take a few days off, saying that maybe the stress was affecting me. Even so, I knew that it was not in my head, and until today I do not understand what I really found in that isolated part of the park. The death bell, sinister encounter on the trail. In the summer of 2019, I had just come home after spending my first year at college. My hometown is a quiet village in the mountains of France, surrounded by a dense forest that I knew since I was little. I always liked to explore the forest, and especially go to an isolated artificial lake that is right in the middle of the woods. This place was special to me. It was where I could relax, feel at peace, away from everything. So, in the first few days of vacation, I decided that I would take a walk there. Got up early as usual, and went alone, something that was never a problem, since I knew the way and had never met anyone there. Took the car and parked on the side of a road that passes near the entrance to the trail. There was no signaling or anything, which always left the lake even more isolated and calm. I went into the woods, going through the way my parents showed me when I was a child. Everything seemed normal until about a 30-minute walk, I heard a different sound. It was a bell sound, faint and distant, like a doorbell that echoed through the trees. At first, I thought it was my imagination or maybe some animal, but the sound became more and more sharp and constant, as if being touched by chance, but always coming from the direction of the lake. I kept walking, trying to ignore the sound and convincing myself that it was just some farmer from around. But the more I walked, the more the bell made me restless. The sound seemed to move, as if it was following me or guiding me to the lake. It was then that, at a point further away from the track, I came across a completely unexpected and disturbing vision. In the middle of the road, near the stream I used to follow, there was a dead beaver with his head cut off. The cut on the neck was precise, almost surgical, something that an animal or any other common predator would never do. I stood there, staring at that strange scene, trying to understand what was happening. The body of the beaver still looked fresh, without the strong smell of decomposition, which indicated that he had been killed recently. The worst thing is that I couldn't see his head anywhere. At that moment, the feeling that I wasn't alone intensified. I looked around, but the forest seemed empty and silent, except for the occasional sound of the bell that continued, even more distant but present. The discomfort turned into a growing fear. I knew I had to get out of there, but at the same time I was determined to get to the lake, as if finding that familiar place could ease the tension. I kept walking, now with more hasty steps and always looking over my shoulder, hoping to see someone or something. After a few more minutes, I finally reached the lake. That place, which always brought me peace, now seemed different, strange, as if it was wrapped in a heavy and too quiet atmosphere, as if nature itself was warning me to go away. Stayed in the lake for a short time, without being able to relax. The idea that something was watching me and following didn't leave my head, and I felt my heart beating faster. When I decided to go back and retrace the way back, I realized that the sound of the bell had stopped, leaving the silence even more oppressive. I rushed forward, trying to keep calm, but when I got to the point where I had seen the beaver, he was no longer there. The floor was clean, without traces, as if there had never been anything there. This discovery made me completely panic. The beaver simply disappeared, leaving no trace, and now the forest looked even more hostile. It was then that I felt that presence again, a feeling that went beyond fear, as if someone was there, hidden, waiting. Accelerating the pace, I headed towards the car, but with each step, the discomfort only increased. It was at this moment that I heard heavy footsteps behind me, accompanied by a sound of something beating lightly, almost as if someone were carrying a bell. The sound was low, but close enough to make me run. I ran along the trail, jumping over roots and rocks, no matter what I left behind. The sound of steps and bell became faster, as if the thing or person was getting closer and closer. It was complete despair, a race against something I could not see but knew that I was there, closer and closer. For a moment, I had the impression that I saw a shadow passing quickly between the trees, but I did not have the courage to look straight, just kept running. My legs were already exhausted, but the adrenaline pushed me to continue. I could only think of getting to the car and leaving there as soon as possible. When I finally saw the outline of the road between the trees, a huge relief took me, but it lasted only a few seconds. As soon as I stepped on the edge of the trail, I heard the bell again, much louder, as if it was right behind me. I looked back quickly and among the shadows saw a tall, distorted figure, almost human but not completely. She moved in a strange way, with a bell hanging on what seemed to be her waist, which swung at each slow step. Without thinking twice, I ran to the car, unlocked the door with my trembling hands, and went in, locking everything immediately. Turned on the engine, and as I accelerated to get out of there, I saw the figure approaching from the roadside. She stood there motionless, as if she knew I was watching. That presence, that look, even without seeing the face, I felt as if it was something very old, something that should not be there. I managed to get away from there, speeding down the road with my heart pounding and my hands so trembling that I could hardly keep the steering wheel steady. I still felt that presence, as if it had stuck to me, following every kilometer I traveled. When I arrived home, I collapsed in the arms of my parents, trying to explain what had happened, but the words came out disjointed, and I myself could not understand right what I had just lived. They calmed me down and, even suspicious, promised to call the police to check the area. The police went to the scene the next day, but nothing was found. The beaver, my bag that had fallen in the rush, everything had disappeared without a sign. The only thing they found was a shirt folded precisely under a stone, as if it had been left on purpose. That made me shiver. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that forest or what I wanted to achieve, but the sound of that bell still echoes in my mind. A frightening reminder that perhaps not all the secrets of that forest should be revealed. Friend or haunting? The Mystery of Louise. It was early September when I started to notice something strange in the behavior of my daughter, Luisa. She is 6 years old and, like every child, has always had an active imagination, inventing stories and imaginary friends to play with. At first, it seemed to be more of a phase. She told me about a new friend named Ellie, with whom she spent hours talking alone in the room. I thought it was cute and even relieved since, being an only child, I always worried that she felt alone. But over time, I realized that something in that friendship seemed different. It was not like the other times she made up characters. This time, Ellie seemed a constant presence and somehow more real. What made me uneasy was the level of detail that Luisa began to describe about Ellie. On some nights during dinner, She would tell her things that the friend had told her, but that simply did not make sense to a child of her age. Once, for example, she mentioned that Ellie knew the house was older than it looked and that sad things had happened there. This phrase froze me inside because I remembered an old tragedy decades ago that happened in our neighborhood, but which I never talked to my daughter about. As the days went by, the conversations between Louise and Ellie became increasingly disturbing. Luisa began to tell me, with a frightening naturalness, details about old events, such as the construction of our neighborhood, and even about a house that caught fire years before we moved here. In one of these conversations, she mentioned that Ellie knew a whole family had lived here before, but that they had left very quickly and never returned. These stories started to become unbearable, because I knew that a family had actually lived in our house, and what happened to them was something no one else talked about here. I decided to ask Luisa more about this friend and where she lived. She looked at me with a serious expression and said, "Ellie lives at home, Mom." She told me that we are taking care of her place. My heart went wild, and that night I could hardly sleep. I started to mentally go over everything I had read or heard about imaginary friends, trying to find some explanation. But something told me that Ellie was more than a creation of my daughter's mind. I decided that I needed to watch these conversations more closely. One morning, while I was preparing coffee, I listened to Luisa talking alone in the room, as she did every day. She was laughing and talking low, as if Ellie was right there next to you. I got close enough to hear when Luisa said, in a curious tone, "But why was the girl crying, Ellie? She was sad about the baby?" That question made me shiver from head to toe. Knew that one of the former residents had lost a baby just before the fire that destroyed much of their house. It was an old story, never spoken here, and that Louise certainly had no way of knowing. That afternoon I felt cornered. I tried to convince myself that it was a coincidence, but Luisa kept saying things that made me question my own sanity. Decided to face her, so I asked directly, "Daughter, who is Ellie? Has she ever told you anything about her?" Louise stopped, looked at me with a serious expression, and replied as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "She said that she lived here before we arrived, Mom, and that she is sad because you don't see her." My mind seemed unable to process that. It was such a direct and disturbing explanation that I needed a few seconds to absorb what she had said. Luisa continued to play, as if nothing had happened, while I tried to understand whether it was the fruit of her imagination or something beyond that. That feeling of having a presence in our house, something I couldn't see, started to follow me all the time. Every time I passed by the oldest rooms of the house, I would catch myself looking around, as if I expected to see something, a sign that Ellie really lived there. To my surprise, Luisa started to get more reserved about Ellie after this conversation. I asked a few times about the friend, but she avoided the subject, saying only that Ellie was quiet. It bothered me even more. It seemed that Ellie was moving away from me, but she was still there for my daughter, and this movement only reinforced the feeling that something was out of our control. One night, already exhausted with all that, I woke up with the feeling that there was someone standing next to the bed. My eyes took time to adjust to the darkness, but when I looked at the corner of the room, I had the impression of a small and immobile shadow right there. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, but the feeling of a presence in the room was so intense that I could barely sleep again. I spent the rest of the night in the clear, watching the silence, wondering if it was this Ellie that my daughter so often mentioned. The next day, Luisa seemed more excited than ever, and when I asked her why, she answered, smiling, "Ellie said she was happy you saw her yesterday." My heart froze. I could not disguise the shock, and Luisa noticed, but just laughed, as if it was a big joke. From that moment on, I understood that something in our house was really beyond what I could understand. I tried to keep calm for Luisa, but I knew I had to do something to bring peace back to our home. Not knowing what else to do, I decided to seek help. Talked to a close friend who suggested me bring someone who could clean the house, a person who understood these energies and could maybe make Ellie leave. Deep down, I was skeptical and ashamed to be considering it, but for Luisa's sake, I decided to try. I set a day to welcome this person at home, and curiously, Luisa seemed to know that something was going to happen. She was quiet all day, watching my every move, not to mention Ellie at any time. When the person arrived, he did a kind of ritual, walking through each room and mumbling words that I did not understand. Meanwhile, Luisa was sitting on the couch, looking at me with an air of serenity that scared me a little. After the ritual was over, the person told me that the energy was lighter and that Ellie had moved on. At that moment, I felt a wave of relief. Louise just smiled, and from that day on she never mentioned Ellie again. Since then, the house has returned to that sense of peace and tranquility of before. Luisa, without giving any explanation, started to play normally, like any child, without whispered conversations or strange behaviors. Gradually, I was convinced that it had really ended, and never felt that presence around. To this day, I prefer to think that Ellie, whatever she was or represented, has found a way out of our home. When I remember that period, I still feel a shiver, especially thinking about everything Luisa knew about our house and the past of the neighborhood, things she could never have heard anywhere else. Even today, when someone mentions imaginary friends or strange presences, I am silent. My daughter may not remember, but I never forgot her serene look on the day that presence